June 26, 1943. Over France. The roar of radial engines echoed across the sky as the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group flew their first combat mission over occupied France. It was a historic moment. America's newest fighter, big, heavy, and unlike anything the Europeans had seen before, was finally going into battle. For the young American pilots, most barely out of training, this was a test not only of their courage, but also of the machine beneath them. The Republic P-47 had been designed as a high-altitude interceptor, a brute of an aircraft powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. On paper, it was fast, strong, and armed to the teeth. In reality, no one yet knew how it would stand up against the Luftwaffe, the most experienced air force in the world. The Germans, watching from the ground and from cockpits above, did not hide their amusement. The Thunderbolt was enormous compared to their sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. It looked more like a flying tank than a nimble fighter. They nicknamed it the pregnant cow, laughing at its bulbous fuselage and sluggish profile. In Luftwaffe mess halls, jokes spread quickly. The Americans were sending pigs to do an eagle's work. The ridicule stung the young pilots, but deep down, they knew they carried something powerful. The contrast between the two sides was impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe had been at war since 1939. Its pilots had fought over Poland, crushed France, nearly strangled Britain, and clawed their way through the vast skies of Russia. They were veterans hardened by years of survival in the most dangerous skies on Earth. They flew with confidence, knowing the weaknesses of their opponents before the fight even began. The Americans, on the other hand, had just arrived. They were fresh, untested, and inexperienced in combat. Some had never seen a German aircraft up close. For many, this would be their first glimpse of enemy fire. And yet, the Americans had something the Luftwaffe was beginning to lack: numbers. The United States had entered the war with its full industrial might, and factories back home were producing new planes and training new pilots at a pace Germany could not match. Still, numbers meant nothing if the machine itself could not survive its baptism of fire. The Germans laughed because they believed the Thunderbolt was too slow to climb with a Messerschmitt, too heavy to turn with a Focke-Wulf, and far too ungainly to be taken seriously in a dogfight. And in truth, they weren't entirely wrong. Early P-47 pilots struggled with the aircraft's size and weight. Mistakes in tactics often ended in disaster, with young Americans outmaneuvered and outflown by Luftwaffe veterans. But the laughter of the Luftwaffe carried a dangerous assumption that this ungainly brute was weak, that its size was a liability. They could not yet see what lay hidden beneath the Jug's awkward frame. Its massive air-cooled radial engine could absorb punishment that would destroy a liquid-cooled German engine. Its thick armor and rugged construction gave pilots a chance to live through battles that would kill men in lighter machines, and its 8 50-caliber machine guns, when fired together, unleashed a storm of lead unmatched in the skies of 1943. On that first day over France, the Jug did not win glory. It did not sweep the Luftwaffe from the sky or earn respect overnight, but it endured. The pilots came back alive. The German laughter would echo only for a short while longer. The Americans were here to stay, and their so-called pregnant cow was about to prove it could not only survive in combat, but thrive in ways the Luftwaffe never expected. What began as a joke on June 26, 1943, would, within a year, turn into a nightmare. The same Germans who mocked the Jug-S bulk would soon dive for cover at the mere sound of its engine. But on that first mission, no one could yet imagine the transformation to come. The young pilot sat in his cockpit, heart pounding, sweat dripping beneath his oxygen mask. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group had been in combat only minutes when disaster struck. The sky above occupied France was alive with chaos, contrails twisting into the heavens, the drone of engines, and the sharp crack of cannon fire echoing through the thin air. Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt, massive and brand new, had just become the focus of a German ace in a Focke-Wulf 190. The first burst hit hard. 37 cannon shells ripped into the Jug's fuselage and wings. Shards of metal tore through the cockpit. Oil from the damaged engine sprayed across the canopy, coating the glass in a black film that made it nearly impossible to see. Johnson's vision was reduced to a dim blur of light and shadow. His radio crackled with panicked voices, but he was trapped in his own world. A world filled with the roar of an engine struggling to stay alive and the rattle of gunfire pounding against his aircraft ES skin. Johnson tried to bail out. He reached for the canopy release and yanked. Nothing. The canopy was jammed. The metal frame had been twisted by the cannon strikes. Smoke filled his cockpit, and his hands were slick with sweat and grime. He realized in a moment of icy clarity that he was trapped inside a dying machine, locked in a coffin at 20,000 feet. Behind him, the Focke-Wulf closed in. The German pilot, an experienced ace, lined up carefully. He had watched American planes fall before, and this one looked finished. But he wanted to make sure. He pressed the trigger, and more shells slammed into the Jug. Johnson braced for the inevitable flash of fire, the eruption that would consume him. He gritted his teeth and waited for the end. But the end never came. The Jug groaned and shuddered, its wings peppered with holes, its fuselage torn open, but it held together. Johnson felt the impact of each shell, the hammering of explosions just feet from his body, yet the Thunderbolt refused to break apart. Incredibly, the radial engine still turned. Somehow, this battered hulk still flew. The German pulled back, rolled to one side, and came in again. Another burst, more cannon shells. The sky around Johnson lit up with fire. The Jug staggered under the blows, but again it did not die. For a second time, the American braced for flames, and for a second time the Jug absorbed the punishment. Frustration mounted in the German cockpit. He was pouring deadly 20mm rounds into the target, and it refused to fall. He dove in again, firing until his guns ran dry. Shells tore away chunks of metal, ripped through Johnson's wings, and blew holes across the fuselage. By now, Johnson's controls barely responded. The Jug staggered through the air like a wounded animal. Then came silence. The German's ammunition was gone. He pulled up alongside the shattered Thunderbolt, close enough for Johnson to see the pilot's face. What went through the German's mind in that instant, no one knows. Perhaps disbelief. Perhaps grudging respect. The ace raised his gloved hand, wagged a finger in mock scolding, and then banked away, leaving the Jug to its fate. Johnson was alone. His canopy still jammed, his plane riddled with holes. He was bleeding, though he barely noticed. The long minutes dragged like hours. Every vibration, every shudder made him certain the aircraft would finally give up. But it didn't. The Jug brought him home. When ground crews saw his aircraft land in England, they were stunned. Holes gaped across the fuselage. The wings looked shredded. The canopy was black with oil. Mechanics counted 37 cannon shell impacts, and still the Jug had refused to fall. The incident became legend overnight. Pilots whispered the story in ready rooms. German cannon shells, 37 in total, had failed to bring down one American fighter. If the Luftwaffe thought the Jug was soft, they were wrong. Johnson's survival proved something that no statistic or test could show. The P-47 Thunderbolt was almost impossible to kill. From that day on, the Americans carried a new kind of confidence into the skies. They might be inexperienced. They might lack the hours and scars of their German enemies. But they flew a machine that could take hits no Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf could survive. The Jug, mocked as a pregnant cow, had shown its first hint of the terror it would one day inspire. Summer 1943, England. The airfields of East Anglia buzzed with the sound of engines, the thunder of radial power as dozens of P-47 Thunderbolts prepared for another day over Europe. To many of the young American pilots, the Jug still felt like a burden, too heavy, too clumsy, and too unforgiving in a dogfight. Losses in the early missions had been hard. Veterans of the Luftwaffe exploited every mistake, and rookies in Thunderbolts paid dearly. But one man was determined to change that. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group. Zemke was not a man to be intimidated by German arrogance or by the Jug's reputation. A born tactician, he studied the strengths and weaknesses of his aircraft with a cold, analytical eye. He knew the Thunderbolt could never turn inside a Messerschmitt Bf 109. It would never climb like a Focke-Wulf 190, and if his pilots tried to fight on German terms, they would continue to die. But Zemke also knew something the Germans had yet to understand. The Jug had strengths of its own, and in the right hands, those strengths could be turned into devastating weapons. The Thunderbolt's first great advantage was its dive. With its massive weight and powerful engine, the P-47 could plummet from the sky like a stone, building unstoppable speed as it fell. No German fighter could match it in a dive, not the Messerschmitt, not even the Focke-Wulf. Zemke realized this gave his pilots a way to strike without risk. They didn't need to circle and duel like knights in a joust. They needed to hunt like hawks. The second advantage was firepower. 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns lined the Jug's wings, spitting out nearly 13 rounds a second each. Together, they could unleash over 100 rounds in a heartbeat. At close range, it was like flying a wall of lead directly into the enemy. German fighters, lightly built and designed for agility, could be torn apart in a single burst. The third advantage was survivability. Time and again, damaged Jugs came limping home full of holes. Pilots lived to fly another day because their machines could absorb punishment that would shred a German fighter. For Zemke, this resilience meant his men could fight boldly, knowing their aircraft gave them a chance to survive mistakes and return to the air tomorrow. From these truths, Zemke built his doctrine: boom and zoom. The idea was simple, but deadly. His pilots would climb high above their prey, staying invisible in the sunlit sky. Then, with one signal, they would dive in formation, screaming down at unmatched speed. In seconds, they would rake German fighters with streams of 50-caliber fire, break apart the enemy formation, and climb back into the heavens before anyone could respond. No turning fights, no duels. One strike, then escape. Over and over, until the Germans were bled dry. At first, some of the rookies doubted the strategy. They had grown up on stories of dogfighting heroes, pilots twisting and turning in dramatic one-on-one duels. Boom and zoom seemed impersonal, mechanical, almost cowardly. But Zemke was firm. Dogfighting was for amateurs and for fools. War was not about honor, it was about winning. And the Jug was built to win this way, not by playing the Luftwaffe's game. The first missions under Zemke's system were promising. Thunderbolts tore into enemy formations, diving from the clouds with thunderous speed. The Germans, caught by surprise, scrambled to react, but often found themselves unable to match the Jug's momentum. Many Luftwaffe pilots tried to follow them in dives, only to discover too late that their machines began to shake, then break apart as the speed tore them apart. The Jug, heavy and solid, thrived where the German machines faltered. Victories began to mount. In the ready rooms of the 56th, the mood shifted. The pilots who once grumbled about their pregnant cow now spoke with pride. The Jug wasn't a ballerina, it was a hammer. And with Zemke's tactics, that hammer was smashing German fighters from the sky. By autumn 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had become one of the most feared American units in Europe. German pilots who once mocked the Thunderbolt began to treat it with caution. Reports filtered through the Luftwaffe ranks. Do not dive with the Jug, do not underestimate its guns, and never assume it will fall after one burst. For the first time, the fear began to flow in the other direction. Zemke himself became a legend. Calm, Calculating and fiercely protective of his men, he proved that leadership was as important as technology. Under his command, the Thunderbolt was no longer an underdog, it was becoming a predator. The doctrine he pioneered spread to other groups, reshaping how the P-47 was flown across Europe. What had begun as a laughingstock in the summer of 1943 was now developing into a weapon of precision. The Jug was not meant to twirl in the skies or dance with opponents. It was meant to strike, to kill, and to survive. With Zemke's guidance, the Americans had found their way of fighting, and the Germans would pay for every lesson learned. The war in the air was changing. For months, the Luftwaffe had mocked the Americans, dismissing their heavy fighters as slow, clumsy machines flown by inexperienced boys. But by the fall of 1943, the laughter began to fade. The Thunderbolt squadrons had a new confidence, forged not in training manuals but in blood and fire over France and Germany. And at the forefront of this transformation stood men like Captain Walker, Bud Mahurin of the 56th Fighter Group. Mahurin was not the kind of pilot who fit the German stereotype of American aviators, reckless, sloppy, and unskilled. He was sharp, disciplined, and hungry to prove himself. In his Thunderbolt, he had found both a weapon and a shield. The P-47 could not dance with the Messerschmitts or the Focke-Wulfs, but with Zemke's doctrine of boom and zoom, Mahurin knew he didn't have to. His task was simple: strike, destroy, escape, and strike he did. On October 4, 1943, Mahurin found himself leading his squadron against a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s near Emden. Diving from above, the Thunderbolts unleashed their 50-caliber guns, streams of tracers tearing into the German formation. Mahurin lined up a Focke-Wulf in his sights, squeezed the trigger, and watched as pieces of the enemy aircraft flew apart. The German tried to roll away, but the Jug's firepower was merciless. The 190 burst into flames, tumbling toward the ground. It was Mahurin's first confirmed kill, the first of many. Word spread quickly. The Americans were not just surviving anymore, they were killing. Pilots like Mahurin, Francis Gabby Gabreski, and Robert Johnson were turning the tide in the skies, scoring victories that could not be ignored. Each kill carried weight. For the Luftwaffe, the loss of a veteran pilot was devastating. Germany's training schools could not keep pace with the slaughter. Replacements arrived with only a fraction of the experience their predecessors had. Meanwhile, America's factories and training programs churned out new pilots and aircraft in endless numbers. The balance of the air war was beginning to tilt. Mahurin's reputation grew with every mission. He was fearless in combat but disciplined, never allowing ego to lure him into a dogfight on German terms. His Thunderbolt became an extension of himself, a machine that could dive like thunder, strike like lightning, and climb back to the safety of the clouds. He was proof that Zemke's doctrine worked, that the Jug was more than capable of standing toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe when used correctly. Reports from surviving pilots began to paint a different picture. The Thunderbolt could dive away from any chase. Its guns could shred a fighter or bomber in seconds, and its pilots were no longer novices. Each encounter carried risk. Each mission drained their dwindling pool of veterans. By November, Mahurin had racked up multiple kills, cementing his place among America's first aces in the European theater. His success, and that of his comrades, had a psychological effect as well. Confidence spread through the squadrons. The rookie pilots who had once doubted themselves now flew with pride. They had proof that the Jug could win. They were no longer victims of Luftwaffe superiority. They were challengers, predators in their own right. The change was not lost on the Luftwaffe High Command. Intercepts became bloodier. Veteran German pilots, men who had fought since the early days of the war, noted with frustration that the Americans were adapting. Their once predictable opponents were now using tactics that minimized weaknesses and exploited strengths. The days of easy kills were ending. For Mahurin, every mission was a test of nerves. The skies over Europe were unforgiving, filled with flak, with deadly German fighters, and with the ever-present risk of mechanical failure. His victories were not just personal triumphs. They were symbols of a broader shift. The United States was no longer the newcomer in the war. It was becoming a dominant force, and the Thunderbolt was leading the charge. By the end of 1943, the story of the Jug had changed dramatically. What had begun as a machine of ridicule was now a respected predator. Pilots like Mahurin had proven that in the right hands, the P-47 was not a lumbering cow, but a thunderclap of destruction. The Luftwaffe, once untouchable in the skies, was starting to bleed. And the Americans, once dismissed as amateurs, were writing the first chapters of a new kind of air war, one in which numbers, tactics, and resilience would crush the myth of German air superiority. The tide was turning, and the men of the Thunderbolt knew it. For the first time, the fear of the Luftwaffe was beginning to give way to something else: belief. February 1944. The skies over Germany. The Americans called it Operation Argument. The Luftwaffe would remember it as Big Week. For 6 relentless days, waves of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators droned across the frozen skies of Europe, their bomb bays loaded with destruction for the factories that kept Germany's war machine alive. Their target was not just steel and concrete. It was the heart of the Luftwaffe itself. If the Allies could cripple aircraft production, they could starve the German Air Force of the machines it needed to survive. But those bombers needed guardians. Without protection, they were easy prey for the veteran pilots of the Reich. This was where the P-47 Thunderbolt stepped in. By early 1944, the Thunderbolt had already proven its toughness and its guns. But Big Week would test something greater: endurance. The bombers were flying deeper into Germany than ever before, beyond the range of many escorting fighters. The Jugs, with their heavy frames and thirsty engines, had to stretch every drop of fuel to stay with them. For the American pilots, it meant hours of bitter cold, high-altitude tension, and the knowledge that death could arrive in an instant. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had left. From bases across France and Germany, swarms of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s clawed into the sky, eager to rip apart the bombers before they reached their targets. For years, this had been their domain. German pilots, many with hundreds of missions under their belts, circled like wolves around the bomber streams. But now the wolves faced shepherds with teeth. The Jugs flew in disciplined formations, watching the sunlit sky above and behind, ready to dive at the first sign of an attack. The battles that followed were some of the fiercest of the air war. Over Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Leipzig, and Brunswick, the sky turned into a swirling storm of contrails, tracer fire, and burning wreckage. Thunderbolts screamed down from above, their 8 50-caliber guns shredding German fighters in brutal bursts. In one clash, Captain Bud Mahurin himself dove on a Messerschmitt trying to break through to the bombers, his guns cutting the German apart in seconds. Elsewhere, Robert S. Johnson and Gabby Gabreski added to their tallies, their Jugs tearing holes in Luftwaffe formations. But the fighting was not one-sided. The Luftwaffe struck hard. Bombers fell in flames, crews bailing out into the icy void, their parachutes blooming against the pale winter sky. Thunderbolts, too, were lost, riddled by cannon fire or swallowed by black puffs of flak. Pilots fought for their lives at 25,000 feet, each second a gamble of steel, fire, and nerve. Yet the Americans had something the Germans could not match: numbers. Every Jug lost could be replaced. Every pilot shot down was another vacancy quickly filled by a new graduate from stateside training schools. For the Luftwaffe, the losses were irreplaceable. Each dead or captured pilot represented years of experience gone forever. Every factory smashed by the bombers meant fewer fighters to fill the gaps. Big Week was not just a battle, it was a slow bleed, one Germany could not afford. By the end of February 1944, the cost was staggering. The Allies had lost hundreds of bombers and fighters, and the skies over Europe were littered with wreckage. But the Luftwaffe had been mauled. Thousands of sorties had drained its strength, and hundreds of experienced pilots were gone. For the first time, the balance of air power was visibly shifting. The Reich could still fight, but the edge was dulling. For the men flying Thunderbolts, Big Week was both a nightmare and a revelation. They had faced the Luftwaffe at its fiercest and lived to tell the tale. The Jug had proven it could endure the long hauls, dive into the worst of the fighting, and bring its pilots home again and again. Its heavy frame shrugged off punishment, and its guns spoke with a voice that no German aircraft could ignore. The psychological shift was just as important. Before Big Week, many American crews had doubted whether the air war could ever be won. The Luftwaffe seemed too strong, its veterans too skilled, its grip on the skies too firm. After Big Week, the doubt began to fade. The Germans were not invincible. They could be hurt, they could be beaten, and they were running out of men to replace their losses. From Berlin to Hamburg, civilians looked up in fear as the sound of Allied bombers filled the air day after day. For the Luftwaffe, the nightmare was just beginning. They had lost their aura of dominance, and the Americans were only growing stronger. And at the center of this transformation, flying high above the roaring bomber streams, was the P-47 Thunderbolt, once ridiculed as a pregnant cow, now revealed as the steel guardian of the skies. Big Week did not win the air war in a single blow, but it broke something in the German spirit. For the first time, they knew the tide could not be turned back. The Jug had escorted the bombers deep into the Reich and returned, bloodied but unbroken. From this point on, the skies over Europe would belong more and more to the Allies. Yet the Americans had something the Germans could not match: numbers. Every Jug lost could be replaced. Every pilot shot down was another vacancy quickly filled by a new graduate from stateside training schools. For the Luftwaffe, the losses were irreplaceable. Each dead or captured pilot represented years of experience gone forever. Every factory smashed by the bombers meant fewer fighters to fill the gaps. Big Week was not just a battle, it was a slow bleed, one Germany could not afford. By the end of February 1944, the cost was staggering. The Allies had lost hundreds of bombers and fighters, and the skies over Europe were littered with wreckage. But the Luftwaffe had been mauled. Thousands of sorties had drained its strength, and hundreds of experienced pilots were gone. For the first time, the balance of air power was visibly shifting. The Reich could still fight, but the edge was dulling. For the men flying Thunderbolts, Big Week was both a nightmare and a revelation. They had faced the Luftwaffe at its fiercest and lived to tell the tale. The Jug had proven it could endure the long hauls, dive into the worst of the fighting, and bring its pilots home again and again. Its heavy frame shrugged off punishment, and its guns spoke with a voice that no German aircraft could ignore. The psychological shift was just as important. Before Big Week, many American crews had doubted whether the air war could ever be won. After Big Week, the doubt began to fade. The Germans were not invincible. They could be hurt, they could be beaten, and they were running out of men to replace their losses. From Berlin to Hamburg, civilians looked up in fear as the sound of Allied bombers filled the air day after day. For the Luftwaffe, the nightmare was just beginning. They had lost their aura of dominance, and the Americans were only growing stronger. And at the center of this transformation, flying high above the roaring bomber streams, was the P-47 Thunderbolt, once ridiculed as a pregnant cow, now revealed as the steel guardian of the skies. Big Week did not win the air war in a single blow, but it broke something in the German spirit. For the first time, they knew the tide could not be turned back. The Jug had escorted the bombers deep into the Reich and returned, bloodied but unbroken. From this point on, the skies over Europe would belong more and more to the Allies. In one report, a German infantryman described the effect of a single Thunderbolt attack on his column. First came the noise, like a storm breaking apart the sky. Then the earth erupted. Trucks burned, horses screamed, men threw themselves into ditches. We fired upward, but it was useless. When they left, there was nothing but fire and silence. We marched no further that day. This was the reality of spring 1944. The Thunderbolt had become more than just a fighter. It was a terror weapon. It hunted not only machines but morale itself. Every road became a trap, every open field a risk. German commanders were forced to move troops at night, but even darkness was no guarantee. The Jugs, equipped with rockets and bombs, struck rail yards and depots, destroying supplies before they could ever reach the front. The scale of destruction was immense. In just a few months, Thunderbolts destroyed thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of vehicles, and countless supply dumps. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The real victory was in the minds of the German soldiers. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and bleeding from its losses in the skies, could no longer protect them. They looked up and saw only the Jug, circling like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. By the time summer approached, the legend of the Jabo was firmly rooted in the German imagination. Some soldiers swore they could hear a thunderbolt long before it arrived, a phantom noise that haunted their marches. Others claimed they could smell the fuel and smoke of the machine even when none were in sight. Fear had turned into myth, and myth into paralysis. The once ridiculed Thunderbolt, mocked as a pregnant cow, had now become a weapon of psychological warfare. Its strength was not elegance, but raw, unstoppable destruction. From the skies of France to the fields of Belgium, the Jug's shadow stretched across the battlefield, and wherever it fell, the German army hesitated, trembled, and broke. June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The beaches roared with fire. Allied troops stormed ashore under a hail of machine gun bullets, artillery, and mortar fire. Above them, the sky belonged to the Thunderbolt. From dawn onward, waves of P-47s prowled the countryside beyond the beaches, hunting anything that moved. Their task was clear: keep the German reinforcements away from the coast, no matter the cost. Flying low over the hedgerows, the Jugs became the spearhead of the invasion. They strafed columns of German trucks trying to push toward Omaha and Utah. They smashed bridges, turning rivers into barriers that tanks could not cross. They struck artillery positions hidden in orchards, their bombs blasting the guns into silence. Every sortie bought precious minutes for the soldiers fighting their way off the sand. For the German troops, the nightmare deepened. They had expected to fight Allied infantry and armor, but instead they found themselves under constant assault from the air. Columns that dared to move in daylight were torn apart. A convoy of reinforcements near Carentan was shredded by Thunderbolts, the road littered with burning vehicles and twisted bodies. Soldiers began to whisper, "Der Jabo ist überall." The fighter bomber is everywhere. Inside the cockpits, American pilots faced the most dangerous flying of the war. The hedgerows that carved Normandy into tight, twisting lanes gave the enemy plenty of cover. Flak guns hid in farmyards, machine gunners crouched in barns, waiting for the next low-flying Jug. Every mission meant skimming treetops at terrifying speed, dodging fire while lining up targets. Many never returned. But those who did carried stories of devastation left behind. Trains derailed, tanks disabled, convoys scattered. The psychological effect was as powerful as the physical destruction. German commanders found it nearly impossible to organize counterattacks. Every movement risked detection, every column risked annihilation. Even when orders came to push toward the beaches, soldiers hesitated, knowing that a single Thunderbolt could mean death. By the end of D-Day, the Allies had secured a fragile foothold in France. The beaches were bloody, but they held. And above them, the P-47 had played a decisive role. The Jug had transformed the invasion from a gamble into a victory, not by elegance or grace, but by sheer, relentless destruction. The German soldiers who once laughed at the pregnant cow no longer laughed. To them, the Jug was a nightmare with wings. In the skies of Normandy, the Thunderbolt had proven beyond all doubt that it was not just a fighter, it was the hammer of Allied victory. Spring 1945. The Reich was collapsing. What had once been the proud Luftwaffe was now a shadow of itself. Factories lay in ruins, rail lines shattered, and fuel supplies bled dry. When German pilots managed to take to the skies, they were often young boys with barely a dozen hours in the cockpit, facing American veterans with hundreds of missions behind them. Against the Thunderbolt, they stood no chance. By now, the P-47 was everywhere. It no longer belonged only to the high skies of bomber escort missions. It was a battlefield predator. From the Ardennes to the Rhine, Jug pilots prowled the front lines, smashing tanks, convoys, and anything that moved. With bombs slung under its wings and rockets screaming ahead, the Thunderbolt became a flying artillery piece. German commanders called for counterattacks, but time and again their plans dissolved in fire before they even reached the battlefield. The psychological terror that had begun in France spread deep into Germany. Villagers froze at the rumble of engines overhead. Wehrmacht troops whispered of Jabo fever, but by 1945, it was no longer just fear. It was despair. They knew the skies belonged to the Allies. The once invincible Luftwaffe could not protect them, and every road, every rail line, every factory lay vulnerable to the Jug's wrath. Pilots like Gabreski, Johnson, and Maharin had become legends, their kill counts rising as the Luftwaffe bled out. But the Jug's legacy was not just in air-to-air victories. It was in the destruction of Germany's war machine on the ground. Thousands of tanks, locomotives, and vehicles lay twisted and burning in its wake. Wherever the Jug flew, the German war effort slowed, stumbled, and finally collapsed. When the Allies crossed the Rhine, Thunderbolts flew overhead in endless waves, hammering retreating columns. By April, German forces were surrendering in droves, often without firing a shot. Many soldiers admitted later that it was not the infantry they feared most. It was the Jug. The sight of its silhouette diving from the clouds broke their will before the battle even began. And so, by the war's end, the transformation was complete. The aircraft, once mocked as a pregnant cow, had become the nightmare of the Luftwaffe and the scourge of the German army. It was not elegant, nor graceful, nor glamorous. But it was relentless, it was tough, and it was everywhere. In 1945, the Luftwaffe was broken. Its veterans gone, its factories silent, its spirit crushed. The Thunderbolt, forged in ridicule, had delivered judgment from the skies. To the men who flew it, it was a lifeline. To the Germans who faced it, it was doom with wings. The war in the skies had been decided, and the P-47 Thunderbolt stood as proof of Allied air power. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more untold Y2I chronicles.